Hello, and welcome to the On the Couch podcast, the podcast that gives you the view from the therapist chair. I'm your host, John Dennis, a licensed professional counselor. You're listening to OTC Episode 3, How to Break Up with Your Therapist. Hey, everybody. Man, so we're back again. Episode 3. Yeah. Man, I just love that intro music by the Topsy Turvies. Man, I just feel like everybody needs a little bit of good, like, pop punk in their life. I know that's not everybody's cup of tea, but my brother and I, we kind of grew up on that and just loved, the energy of it and kind of everything that came with it of, skating and snowboarding. So that always gets me like super pumped up. I love it. Well, like I mentioned in the intro, today's episode, I am excited to be talking with my business partner, Jason Boes, about how to break up with your therapist. And this is a topic that I've not heard a lot of clinicians talk about, and I think it's one that there's just not a lot of information out there, sadly. So many people, thankfully now, I feel like mental health is becoming more and more destigmatized. But I think that so many people struggle with how to end relationships appropriately. I mean, whether that's therapeutic or otherwise. I mean, even just, romantic dating relationships, friendships, work relationships. And I think it's also present in therapeutic setting as well, that people just don't know how to openly communicate and acknowledge when things aren't going well, or when they feel like things have run its course, or when they want to stop coming to counseling. And so often people just drop off the planet. They just ghost. They don't show up for their last appointment, don't call, don't return voice messages or emails or things like that. And it can really make an awkward end to what otherwise was a positive experience. Now, sadly, there are those times where the therapy wasn't a positive experience. And a lot of times I hear stories, when I'm meeting with somebody for a first time and they talk about, oh yeah, I've been to counseling before, or I went, a number of years ago, but it wasn't good. I didn't connect with the counselor or the social worker. I didn't feel like I got anything out of it. And because of that negative experience, a lot of times they won't go back. They're a little gun shy, or they feel like it was a waste of time, or things like that. And they will hold off getting the help that they need because of that one experience. And a lot of times I try to stress to people that, sometimes it takes a couple of sessions to really figure out whether that person is a good fit. And if you feel like they aren't a good fit, that doesn't mean you're not going to be able to find any help. There are a lot of clinicians out there, and it's not one size fits all, and all clinicians are not, created equally, so to speak. That people have different expertise and areas of focus and training and ways of approaching different problems. So I know that that's frustrating for a lot of people to, oh gosh, I don't want to have to, go back, start all over again with somebody else, tell them my whole life story and just keep going through this. And I understand that, but at the same time, if you need the help, you need the help. And it's important to be able to acknowledge that and access the help so that you can move through that situation or that stressor. I did want to explain one or two things with the podcast. So in doing research for starting this project and getting it up and running, everything that I looked up talked about, how important the sound quality was. And I've tried to work pretty hard, I feel, to dial that in and make that quality. And at the same time, to kind of go over a little bit of background on my life. So I actually live on a corner house on a very busy street in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. And so in the background, a lot of times you may hear like cars, sirens. That's actually pretty common for the street that we live on, and it's actually hilarious because a lot of times I end up feeling like Dane Cook. There's so many times where we've heard like an almost accident right outside our house, and you're like, oh, is that the time? And did it? Nope, no, they didn't crash. Okay, and we're good. And then there have been times where like, I've been just sitting in the house or recording. I've been washing a dish. And you hear that crash and you go running out there. I'm waiting for the time when I'm going to be like in the middle of recording the podcast and have to go like trucking out there to, tell the police officer, like, I was in my house recording a podcast and I heard the crash and I came out. So, but in addition to that, when you cut to the interview with Jason in this episode, we recorded this in our office in Harrisburg, and so we have multiple counselors that work in that office. And while we were recording, we had the privacy sound screens that are kind of universal for just about every counseling office to maintain confidentiality. And rather than do retakes and try to re-record to get that perfect sound quality, I wanted to just keep it because I liked the content from the interview, and and also just the understanding that life is not perfect. I mean, as a therapist, that's a lot of what I'm working on with people, is helping them to accept things that they can't always control. And that this is just another example of it, that sometimes that kind of stuff happens, but here it is. So I'm very, very excited to share this interview with you and the conversation with Jason. All right, so I'm here with my business partner, Jason Boes, who I'm pretty excited to talk with him about, how do you end therapy when you've decided that, you feel like you've gotten out of counseling what you want, or you either have concerns about possibly it's not a good fit. So we've been kind of doing this series on how do you find a good therapist? What do you expect out of therapy? And now wrapping up with how do you end therapy? So, Jason, if you can just, for all the kids out there in podcast land, can you kind of share a little bit of background, like you get into counseling, how long you've been doing it, that kind of thing?
Sure. Well, thank you for having me as a member of your podcast today.
Yeah, so of course.
Glad to be here with you. I was thinking about the question initially and realized that I've been in the mental health field now for 20 years, which kind of impressed me, I guess, just hearing that number, and kind of scared me at the same time. But about 15 of those, I've been a counselor in various capacities, working in schools and private practice and community agencies.
Yeah, it's so crazy to think of. Collectively we've probably got close to 40 years of mental health experience. It makes you feel old and wise at the same time. It's kind of, like you said, scary. So what was your interest in starting Parenting and Family Solutions?
Years ago, I attended a training with a counselor who was in individual practice, and I was working, just kind of getting my feet wet, working in an agency, and really appreciated hearing what he had to say about his practice, and thought to myself, hey, I think that's something that I might be interested in someday, and just kind of had it in the back of my mind for a while. And then a few years after that, a colleague of mine, actually Roseanne Murray, provided an opportunity to start a practice and rent a space with some additional support and help, just training me on some of the ins and outs of private practice. And it kind of all began from there. But I think behind that, just noting a need that I recognized in some of my other work in the schools, that parents and families just didn't have really a support system outside of, say, like a school setting, that there weren't enough people really working in that type of a niche, I think, that helped parents specifically in knowing how to deal with behaviors, knowing how to navigate family conflicts. And it's always been an interest of mine, and just thought that we could take that opportunity to, just make that the focus of the practice. So parenting solutions then morphed into parenting and family solutions, and we continue to expand what we can offer to families.
Yeah, and I think that part of, what we talked about in the first episode of, just so often people don't know how to find a good counselor, or they're often asking, for a good counselor. I don't know about you, but I know, like, in my personal network, just friends and family, all people from other states that are like, hey, how do I find this? Which I want to, try to segue into that, like, okay, on when you're ending it, there's, I think, a lot more focus these days put on mental health, and that it's becoming less of a stigma, and people are learning how to access it. But it kind of brings up, a lot of times they don't talk about, okay, how do you end things? Why do you think that is?
Well, I think there are probably a lot of reasons for that. But, if you think of counseling in general, and what that means for people, that can be kind of an uncomfortable and challenging experience sometimes to think about that. But,
well, and I think, it just relationships in general, like we really struggle with when things end, like, how do you appropriately do that? And so often with a dentist or a doctor, it's pretty ongoing, obviously, like maybe with like a pediatrician or something like that, they okay, you've aged out and now you have to transition to an adult care primary care doctor, whereas therapy, and I imagine you echo this as well, but I always tell the people that I meet with, like, my job is to get fired. Like, at some point we're supposed to break up. It's not supposed to go on for the rest of your life. So I try to approach that right at the beginning, even.
Yeah, so I think the therapeutic relationship, it's definitely a professional relationship, but at the same time, it's still experienced as a real relationship. And so ending relationships of any type it's often a challenging thing to do. We don't like to think about it. We don't like to kind of dwell on that side of things. I think it's easier to think about just focusing on the help and support you might need when you're feeling discomfort and you're feeling a need for support, rather than, taking that next step and saying, well, what does that mean when it's over? When I've gotten that level of care or that support that I need, what do we do then? So I just don't think it's really something a lot of people feel comfortable talking about, and really focus more on the relief side of counseling rather than the exit side.
Sure. So are there certain signs that you would look for, kind of thinking of the client side of things, or that the client should look for, that tells them, okay, you may need to find a new therapist? Like, maybe not so much things are ending on a positive note, but more like, okay, there's something there.
Yeah, I would say first, if you're just not feeling that connection with your therapist, if you're noticing that a trusting relationship isn't starting to develop, and then you're feeling uncomfortable, you're starting to feel guarded or restricted in some way, that you can't truly be who you are, can't truly share some details of your life, then that generally indicates that there's going to be a challenge in that relationship that may limit your benefit of the counseling relationship. I would say also that if you're experiencing therapy and then you're noticing that maybe it's not very effective, you're not really noticing any positive changes from the symptoms that you had or started with, or maybe even on the flip side, that you have noticed a lot of changes and you've experienced help and you've experienced support that you've needed, but yet you really don't have anything else to talk about. And you've gotten to that point of saying, okay, what do we do now? Do I just make things up to start talking about? Sure. Or, have I completed my goals at this time? So I think recognizing that, but then also, finally the issue of, we don't like to talk about too, but if there's any egregious act or anything that happens in the counseling relationship, boundary violations, then that's certainly a sure tell sign that this isn't the right fit.
We need to break up.
That's right.
Yeah. And in terms of, if you feel like as the client, again, you don't feel like you need to keep coming to therapy, how would you bring that up?
It's important to talk to your therapist about and have that conversation with them. Hopefully they've already opened the door to that with you and have addressed that in a session with you just about your experience. And that's something that I like to do with clients, is just trying to check in with them. How is this process working for you? Are you feeling that it's beneficial for you? Because ultimately, if it's not benefiting you as the client coming in for sessions, then it's not going to be worth you continuing in most cases. So I think just keeping that open dialogue is really crucial. And, don't feel afraid to kind of have that conversation with your therapist. We've had that conversation before. We're used to it. We know the drill when it comes to that, and it's an important conversation to have.
Sure. And I think it's also, you kind of have to navigate, your therapist at points is going to challenge you. They're going to push you and possibly bring up things about, okay, well, some of the behaviors I'm noticing and some of what you're saying, like, they don't match up. So I kind of navigating that, okay, they're not always going to side with everything that you say or do, but there are points where, the client has to decide, okay, is this is actually helpful and they're challenging me, or no, it's not a good fit. Sometimes that can be kind of confusing. You're listening to OTC Episode 3, How to Break Up with Your Therapist. We'll return in a moment after a brief word from our sponsor.
Life is hard, but Parenting and Family Solutions is here to help. Our board-certified counselors are easy to talk to and offer a safe, encouraging environment to help you with your unique needs. We specialize in helping clients of all ages deal with depression, anxiety, marriage issues, screen addiction, and ADHD, just to name a few. We now have daytime and evening appointments available in Harrisburg and Lancaster and accept most major insurance plans. Visit our website to learn more at www.parentfamilysolutions.com or give us a call at 717-602-5560. Let us help you build a stronger family and a healthier you.
What would you say are the benefits to, discussing the end of counseling and with your therapist? Why bring it up?
Well, I think it's an important conversation to have because when therapy is working at its finest, it's that authentic, real relationship. And in those types of relationships, which we don't often have in our lives, in many cases,
sure,
it is important to just have that openness, and hopefully you do in those types of relationships, and certainly in a therapeutic relationship, you would want to have that openness to dialogue about real things that you're experiencing. And that certainly would be a real emotion that you're experiencing, whether it be looking forward to the end of counseling, and maybe there's an excitement of, hey, I met my goals and I can move on to a new step in my life, or maybe there's a little anxiety about it as well. But either way, there's benefit to exploring that and understanding why you're feeling what you're feeling, and trying to get kind of beneath some of those emotions to figure out what place you're truly in at that moment, to know, yes, I can do this, or no, I think I need some additional support.
And what would you say if your therapist disagrees? Like if you bring that up and your therapist isn't on the same page?
Right, which is certainly possible. You alluded to that earlier, that there are times where in therapy you might feel challenged, and you should feel challenged and maybe even uncomfortable at times. This certainly would be an uncomfortable type of conversation to have. But one that's, again, valuable to have. A lot of times in those uncomfortable moments in life, we find some true emotions, and also some true connection and true feelings of that are worth exploring, to know how to kind of move on and navigate those. Mm-hmm. So, it certainly is a possibility that your therapist might challenge you on that, might question you about some of those thoughts, trying to explore why you might be thinking that way, or what's behind some of those emotions. Mm-hmm. And it's important to ask yourself those questions as well, going into it as a client, saying, okay, why am I feeling this way? Is it a reflection of my own experiences? Have I had experiences in my life that maybe are somehow similar to this emotion that I'm feeling right now? So I think trying to get to the crux of why it is you feel that it's time to end sessions is a positive and valuable conversation that can lead to new growth and insight.
Mm-hmm. And I think so many people are, one, they're afraid of confrontation. They're afraid of that uncomfortability and that awkwardness. And I think, that especially around that topic of like you feeling like you're done, you don't want to continue coming to counseling. If they disagree with you, like, trying to help clients to understand, like, that doesn't mean that you're crazy, or that, like, they're going to, like, block the door so that you can't get out, and, like, call in the people with white coats and, like, take you away. It's, right. It's, especially with adults, they're the consumer. They can ultimately decide whether they continue to schedule, show up, things like that. So, but I think a lot of people have that kind of fear over if the therapist disagrees. In terms of things not ending well, so often clients that aren't comfortable bringing it up, they will just sort of fall off the planet. They will just ghost on you. And what would you say would be possible negatives to that?
Well, I think that could possibly lead to those awkward feelings at times, or those negative emotions that we sometimes experience of not having a sense of completion. Anytime you've had a relationship in your life, or any really maybe project or anything you're working on, and you don't have that sense of closure, it can sometimes feel uncomfortable and can sometimes lead to lingering thoughts about it in some negative ways. Or even questioning yourself, or thinking, did I handle this the right way? Could I have handled this differently? And when you really have true closure, you can often tie up some of those loose ends and maybe not have those questions float around quite as much in your mind. So I think, really for both parties as well. I mean, even as a therapist, there are times where you question, what happened there, or, did this work for this person or not? Was it helpful? But knowing that it ultimately, it is their therapy and it is their choice, but there certainly is value to exploring, even when relationships don't work, or maybe it even did work, but it was helpful for you, but yet not having that closure piece of it, maybe you may not gain it quite as much as you could if you kind of carried out the process to its natural conclusion.
Mm-hmm. And I think of like worst case scenario is when they don't call, don't show, and then you wind up bumping into them out in the real world,
which often happens.
Yes. And it's like, it's that awkward, like, so do we acknowledge, like, obviously on the therapist end, you have to maintain the confidentiality. But yeah, sort of that, hey, how's it going? And yeah, I think, selfishly as the therapist, and yeah, those times when it kind of leaves you questioning, like, well, did they not get out of it what did they not like me as much as I like them, but yeah, and I think also sort of that practice at appropriate communication and ending a relationship well, or navigating just the changes of relationships. It's kind of a missed opportunity when they just fall off the planet like that.
Right. And there may be patterns like that in their lives, or our lives, where we don't really address those difficult things that happen, and they just kind of fade away, and there's never really the closure or that sense of understanding. So yeah, I agree. I think it can be awkward sometimes, but on the same side of it too, it's important if you're in a situation as a client and you see your therapist maybe having a difficult time with that, which could be the case at times. For some in therapy, you hear these stories sometimes. Mm-hmm. It's important. That's another telltale sign that you want to be careful of that connection, and making sure that the therapeutic process is really about you as the client, not about the therapist and their emotions. Mm-hmm. I think sometimes you hear clients take on that ownership, maybe again mm-hmm. patterns that they've been exposed to in their lives, where they're carrying the emotions of the therapist, and it becomes this really unhealthy boundary.
Sure. Yeah. And I think I referenced in the first episode of, I view it as, my job is to get people the best care that I can. And if things have gotten to a place where, as the consumer, you feel like you're not getting that optimal benefit out of it, then my job shifts to getting you to whoever that person is, to getting you a good referral. And as therapists, you're not going to know that if the person doesn't bring it up. Mm-hmm. And a lot of times you hear some of those negative stories of, oh, well, I went to this therapist, but it wasn't a good experience, or it didn't end well, or I just didn't really feel like it was all that helpful. And then they avoided going to another therapist, or avoided seeking services, and oftentimes to their detriment, because they probably would have benefited from finding somebody else. A huge thanks to Jason for being willing to sit down and have a conversation with me about how to break up with your therapist. So just to kind of summarize, you always want to try to end a relationship on a positive note whenever possible. I mean, obviously that's not always doable, but especially when it comes to a therapeutic relationship, you want to use that as practice and as a model for the relationships in the rest of your life. And so using that as practice to openly communicate, bring up any concerns that you have, issues you have, and if you feel it's time to end the relationship, then bring that up, and your therapist should be able to handle that and openly communicate with you about that. In addition, I wanted to give a little bit of insight into the therapist side of things. So in grad school, they typically teach you want to have a termination session whenever possible. They talk about termination session, discharge session. That's a lot of the terms that they use. But that idea of having a last session to wrap up, summarize, end things on a good note, make sure that the client is equipped with any techniques or tools that you've been working on together. Make sure that they have resources or referrals if they should run into issues down the road, and to really, smoothly transition to life after the therapy. So it's a lot of times that's the focus of the counselor, is to have that last session to wrap up. So hopefully that helps people to understand where the therapist is coming from and why they're focused on wanting to end things positively and openly communicate about that. The last thing I want to touch on is if everybody were listening to this, I would want them to know, if you went to a clinician, a professional, and maybe they weren't professional, maybe they were unethical, or maybe you just didn't have a good experience or it wasn't a good fit. But if that was what you got, was counseling that you felt it didn't help you, it wasn't a good experience, I really try to hammer home that idea of don't avoid going back to see somebody else. That if you do feel like you need the help, don't let that negative experience cloud the issue and deter you from getting the help that you might need. Because like I always say, there are so many good clinicians out there, and it's important to really try to remember that. And I know that that's frustrating for a lot of people, and especially for those that deal with trauma or anxiety and are very introverted, and it's very hard for them to step outside their comfort zone and meet with somebody and talk about those things. I get that, I do, but that's going to stand in the way of you getting that help that you might need. And so I always try to remind people that it's important to, sort of get back out there and contact somebody else, set up a session. Don't just let that negative experience be the last word on you getting help. All right, that's it for OTC Episode 3, How to Break Up with Your Therapist. A huge thanks to everyone for stopping by and checking out the podcast. If you liked what you heard in the podcast, please be sure to hit subscribe and review our podcast on Apple, Google Play, or Stitcher. If you're interested in connecting with Parenting and Family Solutions, you can find us at www.parentfamilysolutions.com. You can also find us on the internet and social media platforms with Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, Pinterest, and pretty much just about anything else by searching Parenting and Family Solutions. You can find detailed show notes with links to any references and resources on the podcast website at www.parentfamilysolutions.com/podcast. This is your host, John Dennis, saying good night. The author and host of this podcast is not engaged in a therapeutic relationship with the listener and cannot give counseling advice without a confidential appointment. Listeners should be sure to consult with a licensed therapist in their area or seek emergency medical attention if they are experiencing psychological difficulty. Special thanks to the band The Topsy-Turvies for their song Like a Living Dead. They can be found at topsyturvies.bandcamp.com. The author and host of this podcast is John Dennis. Special thanks to producer and editor Trevor Groff.